Santa Claus.
Saint Nick is such an interesting figure. In some ways, he makes absolutely no sense. He was a real person. He was this holy saint who lived in what is now Turkey, and he was a great guy. Saint Nick. He gave to the poor. He was particularly conscious of the plights of children, but also his legend has accrued throughout the centuries where Saint Nick is also associated with merchants and sailors and other groups of people who are kind of associated with business. But my favorite story about Saint Nick is that he was walking by and there was an open window and he heard a young woman crying because she couldn't afford her dowry, the money she needed to get married. So he, very anonymously just kind of threw some money in at the window. But she happened to be drying her socks over the fireplace at the time. And so the money landed in the stockings. And so that's where we get that kind of tradition of the stockings that you hang and the little gifts, right, that are in those. Throughout the centuries, he becomes kind of morphed with the figure of winter, right? So the Father Christmas and Saint Nicholas were initially two different traditions. The figure of winter is an older man. He wears kind of berries or evergreens. Initially, Saint Nicholas was just wearing a bishop's robe. So, throughout the centuries, these two figures morph into one, but there's still quite a bit of time before we figure out what we really want Santa Claus to be. So if you get to the 1800s, when Christmas cards start to be produced, you have many, many versions of St. Nicholas. Sometimes he's short in stature, so he's, more like an elf. And in fact, the Night Before Christmas poem describes him as an elf, right? And that's also from the 1800s. He's also, not necessarily rotund. He's not necessarily the kind of jolly figure that we associate with Santa. So it's really strange. And I recommend you do this. Go look at some pictures of Santa Claus, a very trim, very fit Santa Claus from the 1800s.
Jacked out.
Yes. He's swole. He's been at the gym. So, but eventually, he becomes more standardized, right? Through really the rise of marketing, but also, of course, we get early Christmas films where we have representations of Santa, and that becomes Miracle on 34th Street, right? Then we get the real image. Or not the real image, but the created image of Saint Nicholas. But he's gone through some really fascinating and I would say very idiosyncratic transformations throughout the years.
Christmas trees.
They're evergreens. They're a sign of life in the middle of winter. And so you can see why kind of naturally the human instinct would be, let's have something in the home that reminds us that these days of darkness and cold are going to end. So why not this plant that is promising, right? That doesn't change and gives us a sense of spring or the seasons changing, coming around, right? But these weren't popular in the early 19th century. It's not until really, the kind of German tradition of not only having these small plants in the home, but also adorning them with ornaments came about that the English in particular picked it up. So there's a particular Christmas card, or I should say Christmas engraving, of Queen Victoria, her children, and Prince Albert around a Christmas tree. So that was unusual at the time, but that image becomes very popular and people print the image and have it hanging on their walls. And then within a few years, everyone in England starts having these small evergreens or pines within their home. Initially, ornaments were mostly fruit, actually. So you would hang apples to remind you of the story of Adam and Eve, but also to remind you of, growth and the promise of spring again, and of course oranges and things like that. But of course, eventually those became plastic toys or glass ornaments, right? So it shifted. But initially, Christmas trees were these small affairs where you would just hang a few items of fruit on them, and it would just be a reminder that spring will arrive again.
Christmas colors. Where do we get the red and the green?
So the green comes, I think, from the Christmas tree, the evergreen. The red comes from holly, because it's one of those few plants that flowers produces fruit in the winter. So it's this unusual combination where the landscape is covered in snow, but you suddenly see a plant that is both green and red. Those are also really rich colors, and they have a lot of associations, for example, with religion. So often, for example, the Virgin Mary would be dressed in either blue or red, but red is a very strong colored. And so green and red kind of make a natural combo for Christmas. And then silver, I think, came in with the snow and that association with winter. And so we get this kind of color combo that is really interesting because you can't really do anything else now with green and red together. I mean, if you in July wear a green and red sweater, somebody's going to say, oh, Christmas in July, right? So it's become imprinted in our imagination in really interesting ways.
Was there any other colors that were in the running and dropped out?
I think blue was certainly there. It used to be, especially in the Renaissance, that, Christmas was more carnival-esque, right? It was more kind of like what our Mardi Gras is like today, where again, it's this communal feasting. It's this, gathering where you've got, carols and things like that. So there was less of a dress code because you could treat it more like a holiday that you didn't have to follow any rules.
Fruitcake.
This is actually very smart. Fruitcake makes sense because when you didn't have a fridge, right? When you didn't have ways to keep food fresh all year long, you had leftovers. By the time you got to December 25th, you certainly had fruit that you had preserved, but it's not fresh fruit, right? And so what you would do is you would take the kind of leftover fruits that you had, and you would pack those into bread because you're also running low on fresh grain and things like that. And so that's why fruit cake is very dense, but it's also not very sweet because sugar used to be a very expensive commodity that you would use only for, like very, very elite occasions. So with that, fruit cake was a more accessible and more kind of democratic dessert that still had some of the sweetness from the preserved fruit that's packed in there, but not enough to make it more like the desserts that we're used to, right? So fruitcake became this kind of, everyone had fruitcake, right, at the time period, and that's starting in the medieval period on upward. So to this day, yes, I have, unfortunately, exposure to fruitcake every Christmas, and I do take an obligatory bite because I feel like I have to honor, all the folks who worked so hard to bring us this food. We have to be grateful for the food, right? But it's not my favorite. Staying
kind of with the food theme, gingerbread.
Gingerbread is I'm a little bit more on board with gingerbread.
Yeah, it's better.
So yeah. Gingerbread is a common cookie or bread base, if you watch, Great British Bake Off, that has been around since medieval period and before. We've had ginger for a very long time. And again, it's a substitute for the fact that we have not had sugar and other spices in kind of ready quantities as much. But I love this story, and we can't prove it. It might be anecdotal. It might be completely made up. But Queen Elizabeth celebrated, she kind of threw a big bash around both Christmas and New Year's, right? She had a big celebration. And one year, to be kind of cheeky, she made her cooks produce gingerbread in the shape of her favorite courtiers. So this would have been Sir Walter Raleigh and, Essex and people like that. And so she gave out as a kind of mocking joke these forms of gingerbread cakes in her favorite basically the men who flirted with her the most got to become gingerbread men. And so, of course, that became something that people started talking about and replicating. And so we have to thank, Queen Elizabeth I and royalty for the fact that we now have gingerbread men and even gingerbread houses, right? It became this tradition that, you could replicate quite easily, even if you weren't of the, royal or courtier class at the time.
Was that scandalous? I feel like that would have been scandalous at the time. Like, she's just making cookies out of all the guys that are coming after her?
Yeah. I mean, well, she's Queen Elizabeth. She can do whatever she wants.
She is the queen, right? She can do what she wants. Okay.
She's the queen. But it is a little, I would say it would be scandalous because she's leading a Protestant/Puritan nation. So any kind of hints at idolatry or at things that are flirtatious, right, certainly it toes the line, right? But it's a holiday, so she can be a little bit more, I guess, again, scandalous or flirtatious during Christmas than perhaps she could certainly during like the Lenten season or during Easter.
Well, Rudolph is from the song, right?
Rudolph is from a massive marketing campaign. We're talking 1920s, 30s. So initially, this guy who works for one of the major department stores writes a pamphlet. And this is something they give out for free to children around Christmas, especially as they're waiting in line for the toys and for, the department stores to open up. And in that story, you get the introduction of Rudolph as the initial reindeer added to the set, right? So he's the 9th. We get the other 8 really from the poem "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," right? Moore's famous poem named those 8 reindeer. But this guy who, roughly 70 years later comes up with this story, becomes this huge it basically becomes this huge thing for children as they're waiting for toys, as they're waiting to participate in the Christmas festivities. They suddenly, become attached to this 9th reindeer with the glowing nose. And then somebody, in response to the pamphlet, again, for the department store in particular, writes the song Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And that, again, spirals to where we now have the movie, and we have multiple kind of adaptations and all of that. But it comes from, how do we keep children entertained while they're waiting in line for hours for these department stores to open so that their parents can spend all their money, right?
Man, it's always the money.
It's always the money.
Coal.
Coal comes from Krampus. So Krampus is the evil version of Santa. And this is a very Germanic tradition that the English in particular have not adopted as much, though certainly you can go see horror films with Krampus and things like that, right? But Krampus is this figure who accompanies Saint Nick on his nightly ride, and he's the devious punisher of Saint Nick. He serves that purpose of, kind of keeping track of children who have not behaved well, right? Eventually that becomes all of Santa's job, right? To track who's naughty or nice. But initially those roles were segregated. So Krampus is the one who initially, it wasn't even coal. He would leave children, and this is terrible, with branches to remind them that they're going to get spankings, right? For as punishment for being naughty. Thank God we changed that to coal as something that is, as it's not exciting for children. It's something that marks their bodies, right? So if you handle coal, it marks your hands, and to remind them, that you have to behave better next year. And so thankfully we've done away with, corporal punishment as a threat here. But it is a kind of interesting element of Christmas that we also have this disciplinarian kind of reminder, right? That you have to behave because, Santa sees everything. It used to be, and this is much more horrifying, that Krampus saw everything. And we still have Krampus in different ways. So not only horror films, but there are races run by, hundreds of people dressing up as Krampus each year. And it's something we've kept in, we've modified it, but we still have Krampus a bit.